let's talk about India, a country that's honestly kind of hard to figure out. In the past 20 years, it's been on a roll, averaging 7% GDP growth and climbing past countries like South Korea, Canada, Italy, France, and the UK. Now it's the 5th largest economy in the world, and if forecasts are right, it'll jump ahead of Germany and Japan soon to grab the number 3 spot. India's 2 richest men have been taking turns being Asia's richest. Tech unicorns are popping up nonstop. Even Apple announced that it's moving 25% of its iPhone production to India. On the surface, India's got momentum. Things look promising. But at the same time, 10% of the population still lives in extreme poverty. A lot of people still have to go to the bathroom outdoors. Mumbai's biggest laundry facility still relies on manual labor to hand wash clothes. And corruption? Everywhere. So, what's really going on in India? Is their economy booming or broken? Actually, people have been saying India is rising since the early 2000s. But now, 20 years later, India is still stuck somewhere between just about to rise and total chaos. So stop wasting time. Your phone's probably at 50% battery. Just right. Lie back, get comfortable, because what comes next is going to be seriously wild. Actually, back in the 18th century, India's economy was doing pretty well. Let me show you a chart that's quite interesting. It's a rough estimate from the IMF, showing the share of major economies in the global economy throughout history. Take a look. The United States began its rise in the 20th century, eventually making up 40% of global GDP. China started gaining momentum in the early 2000s. As for India, you might see just a thin little line in recent times. But if we go back in time, before the 18th century, India's economy was incredibly strong. It basically shared 1/3 of the global economy with China. So you may wonder, what went wrong after that? Well, on one hand, there was the Industrial Revolution in Europe, which caused Western productivity to skyrocket. But for India, the bigger blow was this. The British came knocking. We've all heard of the 2 major East India companies, the Dutch East India Company and the British East India Company. The Dutch came earlier, but actually wasn't too bad. Even though it was called the East India Company, it mostly focused on East Asia and Southeast Asia, so its impact on India was relatively mild. But the British East India Company slowly shifted from doing trade with India to laying the groundwork for British colonial rule. At that time, Britain was deep into the Industrial Revolution. And for things like spices, raw materials, and textiles, they directly extracted them from India. As a result, India remained stuck in agriculture and textile production, with no development at all in industry or technology. If you look at per capita GDP during that period, Britain's numbers shot up fast, while India's stayed flat at the bottom. After World War II, when the British finally left and India gained independence, India's share of global GDP had already dropped from 25% to just 2%. You could say that over 200 years of colonial rule had a truly deep and lasting impact on India's economy. When the British finally left, the Indian people looked around and thought, finally, they're gone. We've been crushed under their rule for over 2 centuries. Now we know what British free trade really means. So India chose to protect itself. The government took strict control of everything, especially industries and banking. Economically, India adopted a planned economy model inspired by the Soviet Union and almost completely shut out foreign investment. On top of that, they created a unique system called the License Raj, where nearly every economic activity required government approval. This system was crucial, and here's how it worked. Put simply, for most businesses in India back then, no matter what you wanted to do, you had to go to the government and apply for a license. If you wanted to start a business, first you'd have to deal with dozens of government departments, file all kinds of registrations and approvals, and spend a huge amount of time and energy building connections just to have a chance at getting that license. But once you got the license, you were golden. The result? India's economy was growing, but very slowly. Then came 1991, a major turning point. The economy was already struggling through the mud, and then reality hit even harder. India's biggest trading partner at the time, the Soviet Union, collapsed. At the same time, the Gulf War broke out, and oil prices suddenly skyrocketed. On one side, India had lost its biggest buyer. Goods couldn't be sold, money stopped coming in. On the other side, the cost of importing energy went through the roof. This double blow caused a serious cash crunch for the Indian government, to the point where it was on the verge of defaulting on its national debt. In the end, India had no choice but to turn to the International Monetary Fund, IMF, and borrow $1.8 billion just to stay afloat. But of course, this is the IMF we're talking about. They were not going to hand over that kind of money without conditions. Of course, that kind of loan came with strings attached. The IMF basically said, sure, we'll lend you the money, but you've got to follow the Washington Consensus and liberalize your economy. And just like that, India was more or less pushed into carrying out a broad set of economic reforms. That meant cutting tariffs, liberalizing interest rates and trade, opening up to foreign investment, and so on. Now, to be fair, India didn't go fully open market overnight, but it did shift toward a market economy, and that made a huge difference. India's economy started moving into the fast lane. Between 1995 and 2018, India's exports grew at an average annual rate of over 13%, ranking third in the world, right after China and Vietnam. Its overall GDP also steadily climbed at around 5% per year, eventually reaching the position of the fifth largest economy in the world. But just to throw this in real quick, when it comes to India's economic data, there's a decent chance that some of it might be inflated. There's been a lot of international skepticism about how accurate the numbers really are. But the truth is, we don't have much else to go on. So take it with a grain of salt, but at least keep it in mind. Now, during India's rise, there was one industry that played an absolutely crucial role. And it's something that feels uniquely Indian: outsourcing. India became, without a doubt, the king of outsourcing. India handles over half of the world's outsourcing business. Pretty much every major US tech company, Google, Amazon, Adobe, Intel, Apple, IBM, has offloaded part of its operations to India. Whether it's basic tech support or software development, if you need help, chances are you'll be talking to someone in India.
Hello?
Now look, let's be honest. That Indian accent, it's not easy to understand, but still these global giants keep outsourcing to India. Why? Well, I think it mainly comes down to three big reasons. First, and the most obvious, it's cheap. The labor cost is insanely low. You can pay someone less than $2 an hour to do the job. Sure, there are other low-cost countries, so why not outsource to Laos, for example? That brings us to India's second big advantage: a huge pool of tech talent. For some reason, Indian families are obsessed with science and engineering education. A lot of parents genuinely believe that the ultimate goal in life is to raise a child who becomes an engineer or a programmer. Because of that, India's education system is especially strong in STEM. And you don't have to take my word for it. Just look at how many CEOs of top global companies are Indian. Google, Microsoft, Adobe, IBM. They're all run by Indian CEOs. And here's the kicker: most of them didn't even grow up in the US. They got their degrees in India, then went to the States to level up. In fact, if you look at Silicon Valley's startups, about 1 in every 4 is run by someone of Indian descent. So yeah, India's tech education system, it's legit. And finally, the third big advantage, and ironically, it's thanks to British colonialism, they speak English.
Your name is beauty.
Now, only about 10 to 20% of Indians can speak fluent English, but even that means you've got almost 300 million people ready to handle global communication. That number alone would make India the fourth largest country in the world by population, just based on its English-speaking population. So it's no surprise that India has basically become the world's call center and tech support hub. I mean, I've personally had to call customer service more than once, whether it was for some online shopping site or an airline. And every single time I was greeted by someone with a strong Indian accent on the other end. When you look at it this way, it all adds up. A huge population, English-speaking workforce, STEM-educated talent, low labor costs. Put all that together, and it's no wonder India became the global king of outsourcing. In 2019 alone, India's outsourcing industry generated over $70 billion in revenue. Some reports even say it was over $100 billion. Either way, we're talking about a massive number, especially when you consider India's local cost of living. So, we've been hyping up how fast and strong India's economy has been growing. You might be thinking, damn, is India about to become the next global superpower? Right behind the US and China? I mean, the economy is massive, and the most obvious reason is simple. India has a lot of people. Like we mentioned earlier, it's already the most populous country on Earth, and some projections say it could keep growing to 2 billion people in the coming decades. And of course, more people means a bigger total economy. In 2021, India's GDP per capita was about $2,250. Meanwhile, in the US, it was around $70,000. That's less than 1/30,000th of America's. Now sure, comparing India to the US might feel a bit unfair. Maybe that's punching down a little. So let's compare it to China instead.
Oh no!
Still not exactly fair. Okay, how about Vietnam? Maybe even that's a stretch? All right, let's go with Myanmar, their next-door neighbor. That one works. See, India's been developing fast, no doubt about it. But even with all this growth, its per capita income still lags far behind. But one thing India has, and most other countries envy, is its population engine. And the key isn't just that India has a lot of people, the structure is actually very healthy. Compared to China, for example, you'll notice that India has very few elderly people and a huge number of young adults and children. India's median age is just 27.6 years, meaning half the population is under 28. Now let's put that into perspective. China and the US have median ages around 38. France is about 42, South Korea is around 43, and Japan, a whopping 48.4 years. With that kind of demographic advantage, it should be a massive strength for India's future. But here's the twist, kind of surprising. Despite having this huge demographic bonus, India hasn't been encouraging people to have more kids. In fact, for decades, India has been actively promoting population control, telling people to have fewer children and have them later. Other countries dream of having a population like India's, but in India, it feels like people keep trying to push it away, so you have to ask, why? The issue India's facing right now is this. It has a massive population, but not enough ways to use it. There just aren't enough jobs to go around. So, when a new person is born, they're not necessarily another pair of hands contributing to the economy. They might just be another mouth to feed, another burden who can't find work. Take India's giant open-air laundry facilities. They kind of prove this point indirectly. You'd think, why not just buy some washing machines? Wouldn't that be easier? Even in a less developed country like India, surely washing machines are within reach, right? But here's the thing. Labor is so cheap in India that it's literally cheaper to hire people to wash clothes by hand than to buy and operate machines. So what does that tell you? It tells you that there are so many people willing to work for such low wages because they don't have better options. So now let's really dig into the deeper problems in India's economy. Why can't it create enough decent jobs for all these people? Well, there are three major issues, and the first one is this: India's economic structure. It's not that there are zero jobs. You've got plenty of work like manual laundry, for example. The problem is that there are very few high-quality jobs, the kind that actually bring productivity and long-term growth. When we look at an economy, it's helpful to break it down into three basic sectors: agriculture, industry, and services. Back when India was under British colonial rule, its economy was mostly agricultural. After gaining independence, the Indian government set out to boost industrial development. But here's the problem. They kept all the key industries under state control, forming government monopolies, and slapped on layers of licensing requirements. So without real market competition, the whole industrial sector ended up underperforming. Then in 1991, after India finally launched economic reforms, things began to shift. India started transforming into a global call center and IT hub, and its service sector exploded. Now, services make up about 60% of India's GDP. Sounds impressive, right? If you just look at that percentage, you might think India's economy is on par with that of developed nations. But here's the catch. India skipped a step in its development. It jumped into services without fully building up its industrial base. Now, some people might say, wait a minute, what about those two Indian billionaires, Adani and Ambani? They've taken turns being the richest men in Asia. Aren't they both industrial tycoons? Well, yes, but here's the thing. Most of their businesses are highly monopolized and they're deeply tied to the government. That's not necessarily a sign of a healthy industrial economy. In fact, it's often the opposite. Take Gautam Adani, for example. In 2022, he was the fastest growing billionaire in the world, shooting all the way up to number 2 globally. But by 2023, after a major short-selling report dropped, his empire plunged, and he became one of the fastest losers in billionaire rankings. The main point here is simple. India's industrial sector just isn't that strong. So to fix this problem, to strengthen India's weak manufacturing base, the Indian government launched the Make in India initiative in 2014. The idea was to offer government subsidies, tax breaks, and policy support to turn India into the world's next manufacturing hub. After all, India has low labor costs, which made it attractive for foreign companies to come in and set up factories. A lot of them did. In the auto industry, for example, General Motors and Kia both invested over $1 billion each. And even more companies showed up in electronics: Foxconn, Pegatron, Huawei, Qualcomm, Samsung, Vivo, Xiaomi. They all built or expanded factories in India. But so far, the results have been pretty underwhelming. Here's the share of manufacturing in India's GDP over time. The government originally aimed to raise it to 20% by 2025, but instead of going up, it's actually gone down. Why is that? Well, one major reason traces back to that License Raj system India used for over 50 years. It didn't just make the country's industries weak. It left behind a much deeper, harder-to-fix problem: bureaucracy, or more bluntly, corruption. And this is what we'd call India's second big issue. The entire economic system ends up working sluggishly and inefficiently because bureaucratic red tape slows everything down, and behind-the-scenes deals and favors often take priority over merit or efficiency. In India, no matter what you're trying to do, whether it's sending your kid to school, going to the hospital, launching a small project, or just trying to get something done, you usually need to grease a few palms. Even something as basic as getting a driver's license? Yeah, you'll probably have to pay someone off. In fact, about 50% of people in India get their license without even taking the driving test. Laws, rules, regulations, a lot of it is just for show. If you want things to actually move forward, you need to know the right people. Send a little gift here, a little payment there, and boom, things get done. According to Transparency International, in their 2020 report, they found that 39% of Indians who had contact with public services in the past year had paid a bribe. That was the highest rate in Asia. And it's this web of red tape and corruption that makes it extremely difficult to run a business in India by the book. So here's what happens. Only about 10% of Indian workers are employed in formal, registered companies. That means 90% of people, the vast majority, are working in the informal economy. That means no official contracts, no labor law protections, no benefits, no taxes paid. Now sure, in many countries, you might find a few small-time hustlers working off the books. But in India, 90% of the economy is unregistered and informal. That's a serious problem, and it fuels a massive underground economy as well. India's third major problem holding back its development is something a bit more cultural and isolated, and that's the caste system. To put it simply, in India's traditional culture, people are divided into 4 main castes, and outside of, or really beneath, those 4 castes, you have a group called the Untouchables, or Dalits. Each caste traditionally came with a set of pre-assigned roles. Brahmins were priests and scholars, Kshatriyas were warriors and rulers, Vaishyas were merchants, Shudras were laborers, and Dalits at the very bottom were left to do jobs like cleaning sewers, sweeping streets, and so on. They weren't allowed to get an education, and castes were not allowed to intermarry. This system has been around for thousands of years, and during British colonial rule, they even wrote it into the legal system. Why? Because it made governing easier. Once people were already ranked, the British could just deal with the Brahmins at the top and let the hierarchy keep itself in check. After India gained independence, the caste system was officially abolished, but by then, it was already deeply embedded in people's minds and everyday life. Even today, people from different castes often can't even be friends, let alone marry each other. A lot of high-income jobs have invisible filters. They may not say it out loud, but certain castes tend to be excluded in practice. And when it comes to marriage, forget about it. As of now, only about 5% of marriages in India are between people of different castes. That alone should give you an idea of just how deeply rooted the caste system still is in modern India. From an economics perspective, if you divide a whole population into rigid categories and then manage them that way, of course it's going to hurt overall efficiency. To try and offset the deep-rooted effects of this cultural system, the Indian government introduced quotas in areas like school admissions and hiring. Basically, companies and universities are required to hit a minimum percentage of people from lower castes. But even with these policies, there's still a huge gap between castes when it comes to education levels, income, and opportunity. Now, just to be clear, this is my personal opinion. Some researchers argue that the caste system doesn't really matter that much in today's India, so I'll let you decide for yourself. But these 3 major issues we just talked about, weak industrial development bureaucracy and corruption social stratification through the caste system, they all lead to one big outcome. India simply can't create enough jobs to keep up with its exploding population, and that leads to a problem India is constantly associated with: extreme income inequality. Think about it. India's per capita GDP is shockingly low, and yet it somehow keeps producing Asia's richest billionaires, even briefly claiming the title of second richest person in the world. In some Indian cities, you'll see skyscrapers on one side of the street and literal slums on the other. That tells you everything you need to know about the scale of the wealth gap. India may very well be one of the most unequal societies on the planet today. Let's talk numbers, because the data speaks for itself. According to the World Inequality Report, India's income gap is pretty shocking. The richest 10% of the population owns 65% of the country's wealth, while the bottom 50% owns just 5.9%. Yeah, that's a huge imbalance. But here's the twist. India's actually not alone in this. Look at the US. The top 10% there owns 70.7% of the wealth. In countries like Chile, Mexico, and South Africa, that number goes all the way up to 80%. So if you're only looking at wealth distribution on paper, you might say, okay, India's inequality is bad, but it's not the worst out there. But here's the thing. Anyone who's actually lived in both India and a developed country like the US will tell you, India's wealth gap feels way worse. Why? Because the bottom half in India isn't just less rich. They're living in extreme poverty. According to the United Nations, anyone earning less than $3.65 per day is considered poor. And in 2019, 45% of India's population, that's over 600 million people, were living below that line. So sure, the ratios of wealth might be similar, but when you look at real-life living conditions, India's inequality becomes brutally clear. But to be fair, India has been moving fast to fix this. Back in 2004, around 40% of the population lived in extreme poverty. By 2019, that number had dropped to just 10%. That means over 300 million people were lifted out of poverty. From that perspective, you've got to give India some credit. It's definitely been making progress, step by step. So let's sum it all up. After India's economic reforms in 1991, the country began to rise rapidly. Thanks to two key factors: a low starting point with huge growth potential, a booming outsourcing industry that connected India to global business. That growth helped India climb all the way to become the fifth largest economy in the world. But at the same time, India's early-era license Raj system held back its industrial growth, fueled bureaucratic corruption, and when you layer in the caste system, India struggled to create enough quality jobs for its exploding population. And that's how we end up with this kind of contradictory India, a country with a booming economy, but with millions still living in deep poverty. It's the classic case of every household has its own struggle. So if India truly wants to break through and become a global economic powerhouse, there's still a long, tough road ahead. Elon Musk once told me, some people get rich overnight because they always like and subscribe to the videos they watch. So hey, maybe you're next.